Good morning and welcome to the webinar with myself, Daniil. Today's webinar is going to be based on Vault, so Lifecycles, Vault Professional, that's found in Vault Professional. It's more or less an introduction to the Lifecycles. We'll just wait a minute longer for any late attendees and then we'll continue. I think we can start. So once again, thank you for joining the webinar. If there's any questions, please, you can raise your hands or type it on the questions poll. We have reserved some time at the end for any questions that you might have, and hopefully you get enough information and value of the webinar. So as mentioned, it is a introduction to life cycles. We run through the agenda very quickly. Okay, so looking at the agenda, we will start off doing the introduction to life cycles. Then we look at the secret of life cycles. So what is life cycles inside of Vault? How to create it, some of the steps on creating a life cycle for yourself. And also we would create an ACME standard life cycle, so the process of creating that. Finally, we look at the job processor, which handles a lot of the jobs in the background for us. So we'll have a little discussion on that, what it does and what's required. And then we've got takeaways. So this is, as mentioned, just a very introduction session. So it's to introduce you to what's available to you. So an introduction to life cycles. If we look at it in here, life cycles are found in your Vault administration side of it. So behaviors, you find a life cycle tab here that you can pick. Standard with Vault, you find there's quite a bit of standard life cycles that's available to you. You can, of course, go in and create your own. You've got transitions, you've got securities, controls, and how does the file progress in from one state to the next. Now, life cycles, to note, is a nice routing process. It's not entirely designed as a workflow. It's more or less a routing. You've also got categories that follow on, as you can see on screen, that's attached to a life cycle. Now, categories is a separate topic that we can discuss in a future webinar. However, life cycles are linked to categories that allow a file to behave in a specific manner. Okay, so let's look at it in more detail. In here, we'll find that before we start looking at it, there's just an introduction to what's happening here. We've got a two-user setup, and one user creates a drawing. So he's called Dan the designer, and what he does is he creates a file and he pushes it to Vault. It could be an Inventor file, an AutoCAD file, you know, a different application file, so a Revit file, a Civil 3D, AutoCAD electrical file. He puts it into Vault and he starts working on it. Now, with as you know, with Vault, we'll manage and track the history of that file. However, when he's done with that, If he moves it across to the next state, which is going to be the review state, that is for someone to actually go in and review the file or review his work. And you'll see here that we've got a user called Ray, the reviewer. He reviews the file to check if it's meeting the standard that they need, or if it needs any changes. If it needs any changes, it goes back to the work in progress state, where Dan can go back and do some edits and modifications to it. Following his modifications, he sends it back into the review state, and in that review state, you would find that Ray would need to either approve it to say it meets the requirements, and if it does, he moves it into the release state. Now, looking at this quick video here, what would happen is, if it's going into the release state, does it get locked for non-editing? So it's more or less just a viewing purpose, and what happens afterwards. So let's have a look quickly. So in here, we've got Dan the designer. The file's in Vault already. We can preview the Vault. We can preview the file. We can used. We could also go in and see the comments that's been added. If Dan changes the state, notice that he's using the flexible release process. It's in work in progress. He adds in a comment, and he gives Ray a message, view the file. Now, this can be any comment that you want to place in here. However, if you change the state for review, it defaults back to it. Nevertheless, the comment is not lost. We can always pick the comment up and OK it. Now, notice that the state has moved work in progress to a review state, as you can see in there, and the comment is tracked. Now, what's great about this, if we log out and log in with the next user called Ray, in the folder where that file lives, we can see that it's in review, and there is some comments added. So it's asking Ray to actually go in and review that file. Now, we can look at the different versions of that file, or we can show just the latest version that's there. If we look at the users of that file, you can see that if it's linked to other files, or if it's got child relationships linked to it, it would come in. We could also pick up the change order if there's there. We can do a preview of the file as well. And what this generates, it generates a viewing file, a visualization file in the back end for us. And we could actually preview the file. Now, a lot of the times, these visualization files are handled by the job processor that we'll come to later on and discuss. But if we want a file that's available directly or immediately to us, we've got to generate the preview manually. Now, of course, this file has nothing in it, so it would show in blank. Now, in here, a little trick. As you can see on the preview panel, you've got the prints, the view, zoom, measure. If you open up your Vault using the right click, so right click run as administrator, when you preview a file, it would allow you to do redline mockups. So it's just a quick side tip there on that. If you want to actually do any mockups on that visualization file itself, if you right click as administrator, when you start up your Vault, you'll be able to see the options to actually do the mockups. Now, moving along from that, we saw that Ray can actually see the file. He's the reviewer. It's in his state. He sees the file. He does his review changes to it. What if there's, go back to Dan now. Sorry, let's go back to Ray. If we look at what Ray's doing here, he's viewing the file. He can see there's quite a bit of changes there. He changes the state. He's happy with it. He's found out that the file is fine. It doesn't need any changes. He can move it onto a release state. So he releases it for manufacturing. Notice what happens. You have a lock and your revision has changed. Now this is pre-set up in the backend, which allows you to go in and bump a revision if there's a change state. Also, a lock that's put onto it. A lock would allow us not to do any edits to it. If we go log in as Dan again, Dan previews the file, also released, revision B, there's a lock onto it, and you can see it's released for manufacturing. If we try and change the states, perhaps to obsolete, okay, and you can move it to obsolete if it's no longer in use. All right, so if it's no longer used for manufacturing or purposes, you can move it out to obsolete. Now, we logged in as Ray again. Now, if Ray has to, if there's something changed in the environment where you find that there's the product's released for manufacturing, the design is released, it's being manufactured, however, there is a change that needs to happen. Perhaps it's a material change or they found an issue while manufacturing it. So we all know that there's always changes that come up when a product is being manufactured. If that change needs to be tracked and moved along, it just cannot be changed up into review state like what's happening here. You could have securities that don't allow that. Now, if I've changed it to review, notice that it comes up with an error. And if we look at the detail of the error, it tells us that some of the criteria, predefined criteria, do not match. What this means is that if we had to bring a drawing from released back into work in progress, notice that it wants to know why you're bringing it back, because it was locked initially. Now it needs to find out if there's any changes, and if there's any changes, are those changes being tracked? So if we dig into that, notice that we can bring it back into the work in progress state only if we attach a change order, an ECO. I'm just going to create a quick ECO here. Just save it and submit it. Okay, an ECO is a nice notification, as you've seen there. You can set up a due date for it, as well as an email routing for the people involved in that ECO. We bring it back. There's an ECO linked to it. So if we track the history, you can see that there's an ECO linked to it. That ECO number can be assigned by a predefined numbering scheme. Alternatively, Vault will assign a number to it. So we've done the ECO. Now let's try and bring it back to review. And boom, we can. So notice that if it has an ECO link to it, and on that ECO, we've got all of the changes that needs to happen to it. It could be any PDF documents, it could be an image, it could be a Word doc with the write-up of it, or it could be a markup. We attach it to that ECO and attach that to that file, and we bring it across. Now, also something to point out, the state has changed to review, as well as the version of that, the revision of that has changed. The version tracking will also track the version because there has been changes to it. If we look at the state again, we can see it's in review. We can bring it back to work in progress from review, and it's out of Ray's environment. Now, the way this is set up is that viewing rights is accessible for certain people in the life cycle. So you could have it set up in a way that you would have, for instance, just the designers or draftsmen working in the work in progress state, so they see all the work in progress files. If it's a reviewer, you don't want him getting too much involved in the design. You want him just reviewing. You give him review access only, so he only sees what's in his state, which is review. Released should be everyone. So if we go back to Dan, we can see that Dan has got the file now in the review state. It comes back to work in progress. So ideally, making it, we can look at the change order that's linked to it. You can see the change order is open, and we could ideally make it convenient for the users that's following this life cycle. Now, it is a routing process. As you've seen, the file is being routed from different in the design workflow. Okay, so moving along from that, so workflow for designers. Now, in here, typical workflow for designers is work in progress. So it's a creation of a file. It could be a revised state, right? Following that, it could be a review state. So once the file has been worked on, it's moved on to the review state. Following the review state is the release state. Okay, so this is your read-only. It's published in read-only. Now, another nice thing to note here is that Vault will allow you to create a PDF of the released file once on release. So it's handled by the job processor in the background. What would happen is, as soon as that file is released, it would create a PDF for you in the background. That PDF can be stored in a different folder, or alternatively in the same folder underneath that file. Okay. You've also got a different state, which is the minor update state, or you could call it a quick change. So instead of bringing it back into the whole process or with the engineering change order, if there's a minor update, you move it into the and that can be worked, and the file would live from there. Alternatively, if a component is going into an obsolete state where it's not being used anymore, it's just kept for reference purposes only, that could be moved into the obsolete state. That's some typical workflows that we've picked. So let's have a look and see from a documentation of the life cycle. Now, we're going to dive a little bit into the routing process in here. Okay, so typical workflow for designers. We notice that there's a work in progress. Be creating the file. Okay, then the next state we look at is the review state. So this is someone that's checking it or reviewing the file. Following that, it gets released for manufacturing. Now, on release, you can see there, you can bump a revision. It could be alphabetic or numeric, right? Depending on your requirement. And on the release state, it's going to be a locked file. If there's any minor updates from the release state, we can push it out to the minor update state, and these states can be renamed to your working environment. So if this is not the terms or the headings that you would call it, you could modify that to suit your environment. And of course, there's obsolete. So once it's done, it's not used anymore, it moves into the obsolete state. If we look at something for the R&D department, so the typical workflow for the R&D department, they come up with a draft copy of something, they move it from the draft to a release state. They could bump up the revisions, the primary revisions if needed, and then they typically work with 3 revisions of that. So the revision 1 or the first revision, then they've got a major revision that comes into it, and then they've got a minor revision that comes in it. So these are typical workflows that we've seen some of our customers do and how they work with it. And of course, once they've released it, it goes into the design state, which is back into the work in progress, and then it follows the lifecycle routing from the design point of view. All right. How do we create this in Vault? So let's have a look how we would typically do this. So in here, the combined process of a lifecycle definition, as we've seen, it could have 2 sides to it. It could have an R&D side to it, or it could have a plain designer side to it. But if we look at the state of the lifecycle, we could link in the 2 states. So you could have 2 lifecycle states that work in conjunction or work from one to the other. And the lifecycle states that can be set up would be very customized to a user or yourself. How would they want it to go? Now, if we look at it in here, there's revisions and versions that come into it. So there's a big difference here between the revision and version. Let's have a look at a version. What is a version? A version is when a design is created, when it's checked in, or if you change a state, the file gets a new version, right? It's driven by history, so it's driven by what has happened. So you could have you could have as many versions on a file as it moves along. Now, this could be restricted as well. So we've seen people that restrict their file versions to maybe 5 or 6 or 10, but you could have it set to create versions for any check-ins or any state changes that come in. Following that, the revision is the next thing. Revision is either revised manually by a user or when you do a transition from a different state. For instance, released for review to released, or released to work in progress. Now you can see that you could bump a revision up there. Now with revisions, it could be set up in different types. So you could have alphabetic or numeric. You could have primary, secondary, or tertiary revisions. And what this means is if it's a combination of numeric and alphabetic, it could be A1, and you could have that would be a secondary, so A1.1, or a tertiary could be A.1.1.2 in that order. However, the tertiaries are not very commonly used. It's more the primary and secondary. Okay, so if we had to start it up, what you see in the top there, the alphabetic side, that's the version that's being created because it's being checked in and checked out and being worked. As we move it along, it moves into its released R&D release state. So from there, it needs to move on to the work in progress state for the design lifecycle. Now in here, you see that it's still on version number 6. As it's been worked, it's being reviewed, or it's being released, it goes down to the release state, and the revision has bumped to A1 at the bottom. And if it's going out to a complete release state where it's locked totally, you see that we could also have the revision bump as well. So we could have revision bumps on states if required, or only when it's released. So ideally, what you'd want to do is you'd want to whiteboard this out before you create it, because as we mentioned, Vault comes with predefined life cycles inside of it, and you could go and modify that. Now, the lifecycle definition looks something like the screen grab as you see on the screen there. What's very important is the securities that's linked to the lifecycle. Now, securities is quite a big topic that plays a major role in a lifecycle state, or also just a Vault itself, how you manage the file, who sees what, where, and when. Okay, and as you can see here on this lifecycle definition, there's multiple there, and you could, of course, go and create and reorder them as well. Now, in this simple lifecycle state, you can see there's the R&D side of it, as well as the design side of it, which has work in progress, for review, release, obsolete. And of course, there's a quick change as well for modifications. So if we look at what the usages are, so what's going on in here, you can see that there's permissions that come into it. So you've got your engineers, you've got your manager, you've got the CAD admin, you've got people reviewing it. What can they do in what state, all right? And if we look at it, so every user is assigned a role or into a group. So ideally, you want to have them grouped, because it's a lot better to manage a group than a single user. It's a lot quicker. You give them access to a specific role. So again, administration gets involved here. You got to actually give them certain administration in certain rights into specific transitions of the role. So as it transcends from a work in progress, for instance, to a review, who can actually make that change and who can actually view that change. And then you've also got a role of an editor. So that person can read and write, and you've got a consumer who reads it. And of course, the administrator administrates the complete side of it, so he can have a read, write, and delete role. So what's great about this, and we found this quite helpful with specific implementations, we found that prior to having a system like this set up, users were able to actually go in and delete a file, which is not ideal, because you always want to keep that history, right? So we found users were deleting files. If you give them the correct roles and rights inside of Vault, you can restrict them from deleting a file in Vault. Okay. So again, categories. We've spoken about categories initially. Categories, it's the glue and the gatekeeper of the whole Vault system with regards to life cycles. You find it in the behaviors tab. Okay. Again, Vault settings, administration, Vault settings, behaviors. You find categories in there. It's just under life cycles. It all starts off with categories. So creating categories and the category rules behind that. Okay. What this allows us to do is allows us to switch to a life cycle, for instance. So if you look at it, there's multiple categories that's created here. This what it does, it allows you to capture a specific design type that comes in, or file format that comes in. It could be for office design, it could be for general engineering, inventor designs, AutoCAD designs. If it's PDFs, you can allow that to be categorized in a specific way. Okay. Also allows us to revise something, a file, for instance. We can add a revision scheme to that, and also a defined property that links up with. Now, properties are very, very critical in Vault. It either pulls a property from a file or from Vault to a file. And that, of course, is also a separate discussion as well. So we don't have to go in, of course, create any category for a viewing file, a DWF file. It creates it automatically in the background for us. Next, we're going to look at some information about creating the category itself. So we'll create it for an ASME standard. Okay, so to create the category, again, tools, administration, Vault settings. We go into category, and from there, we've got two different types of categories. Well, more than two, but we'll look at different types here. We've got folder categories and file categories. Now, the folder category will categorize a folder specifically, and a file category will categorize different files that go into Vault, that you're putting into Vault. And again, this could be Word file, Office files, so Word docs, PDFs, Excel sheets. It could be CAD files, your AutoCAD Inventor files that could be categorized. All right. So very easy to do it. Click on New, and then create a category, name it. Okay. And following that, you can assign a rule to it, because remember, every category should have a rule assigned to it. And following that, you could do the revision scheme for it. So it's basically assigning certain components that need to come into it. So revision schemes, again, as we discussed, you've got different types of it. You've got alphabetic. So for this ASME standard, they're using alphabetic revision scheme in here. You can edit and modify the revision scheme. If you've got a numeric revision scheme, or if you've got a revision scheme that's in a text file that's existing, you could import that in as well instead of creating it. Okay, and as you can see there, you could add multiple revisions. There's primary, there's secondary, and there's tertiary revision schemes that you can have assigned to a specific category. Okay, you could preview it, and again on the side you can see the different schemes that you could use in it. Okay, rules. Okay, so when creating a rules of the category itself, again, it's in your Vault settings, into behaviors and tools, and if you click on the rules category, the rules tab at the bottom there, you'll find that there's specific kinds of rules that you can apply to it. So you can create a rule as well. So it could be a file extension rule. As you can see at the bottom, file extension contains txt. That categories that have a text, all files that have an ending with txt will be assigned to that ASME standard that comes in. Okay. You could also have a file name starting with, and the good thing about this is you can use function as well. Okay, you could test a file first. Ideally, you want to test a dump file that you put into it as well. So you just want to drop in a file to test if that category is working once you've created it. If we look at the life cycle of the ASME, okay, so you create your life cycle. Again, by creating the life cycle, going into a life cycle, I would go in here, and generally I would copy cycle. It just makes it a lot easier when doing it, or you could start it from new itself. So copying a flexible release process lifecycle, you could delete the first migration step of it. You could add different definitions to that, right? And you could also reorder it at the bottom. So if we look at the snapshot, see that it's got different states that's there. You've got work in progress, review, release, quick change, obsolete, and there's a final one called migration. You could go in and reorder that or edit that naming convention that's there. On the right to that, you see that there's general tab, there's transitions, security, control, and comments. What that does is allows us to actually see how that lifecycle is routing, or how that file is routing in the lifecycle. Now, if we look at it, the transition side of it, you can restrict certain transitions. So you could uncheck the restriction in here. So work in progress for review. If you look at the securities on that, you could go in and either restrict certain access to this, so certain users would have certain access to see what's moving across and how to move it across as well from here. Okay, the revisions tab, so bumping a revision, it's under your action. So if you have to add a revision bump, if it moves a state, you would make sure it's selected in your actions tab. And the fifth one is if it's going to be a criteria that you're going to add to it. So you would have to put in revision scheme is alphabetic. Okay, it could be anything, any property that you choose from here. In this one, it's going to be a revision. So what happens is if it's not alphabetic, you can also set it up that it does not move. So enforcing a rule for a user to actually move it across, if it's only time it can move across if it's got a alphabetic revision scheme index attached to it. Okay, and then also allowing people to this. So who has read-only rights? You've got read, modify, and delete rights in here. You can allow users to actually just read it or modify it if needed, or you could allow them to delete as well. So you could restrict them from deleting or modifying it directly in here. And of course, you can test this out. Once it's completed, you can test it out. Okay. Categories again, creating categories. Again, we looked at tools, settings. You've got your categories tab that you can create a category, file categories or folder categories. Going into it, similar process, create a new category. And the great thing about categories is that you've got at the bottom of the screen, you can see that there's specific behaviors you can attach to it. Assign a life cycle to it, a revision scheme can be attached to it, also the properties that you want the categories to behave to. Okay. Once you create a category, you can choose a color that it needs to obey by, and then of course give it a small description behind that. And then if there's any rules that needs to be affected to it, so there's affected rules that you can create for it, you could go in and go into your vault settings and go into your rules tab and create the rule for that category. Okay. Assigning a revision scheme to it, you could create or reuse a revision scheme. Remember, it could be alphabetic or numeric, as we see in here. You click on edit and you allow to assign a specific revision scheme to that. Okay. Again, you could import if it's a revision scheme that you have existing, you could import it into the system as well, or alternatively create a new one here. And once that's assigned, you could assign it to a specific category and have that revision scheme follow along with that life cycle. Okay, so some of the rules, just to look at some of the rules of this ASME life cycle that we've got there. We create the rule first, and of course we go into tools, administration, vault settings, rules to create our category rule. We click on new, we name and assign the category, apply rules on object creation, right? And then we look at the create rule condition. So what conditions must that rule behave or abide to? If we look at in here, the screenshot explains it a little better, where you see the ASME, it's got a rule creation that's there. So it's a property, it starts with ASME, for instance, you add that, point number 3, you add that to the rule criteria. And one of the most important things that a lot of people forget is point number 4 there, which is apply rules on object creation, right? And again, once you've done that, test with the dump file that has nothing on it, just to make sure that it is catching that category when you add the file to Vault. Again, creating a lifecycle itself. What we've done in this snapshot here was just copy a flexible release lifecycle, and we are allowed to actually modify it. So we could restrict transitions on that, and then specifying security, specifying users that need to come into it. You could bump a revision as you move the lifecycle through, and also add a transition criteria property to that. So you could say it must obey the alphabetic index of the revision. And then finally is the read only for released. So as you can see there, Everyone is allowed to read, no one is allowed to modify or delete. Okay, and your revision scheme that comes in. That's a quick recap of how to create that category and how to create the life cycle for it. Now, the next stage we can look at, if you have any questions, we can take some questions before we move on. You can type in the type box or just raise your hand. Alternatively, we could do it at the end as well. Okay, no hands being raised. We'll carry on. The next section we're going to talk about is just a brief overview over the job processor, also called the job server. So what does the job processor do? The job processor runs in the background. So it's installed generally depending on the amount of jobs that's being pushed to it. It's installed on a separate computer. You could have it installed on a machine that has Vault on it, an Inventor or an AutoCAD on it. What it does the work for you in the backend. So basically, if there's a file that needs to be created from a review state to a release state, a PDF file that needs to be created, the job processor handles it in the background. If the visualization file needs to be created, you can have that handled by the job processor in the background. If there's any revision updates to happen or any property updates, you could have the job processor handle that in the background. What it does, it eliminates the user from manually doing it, so it makes it a lot easier. The job processor does not run immediately. There's a queuing system, a timing queuing system. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's 10 minutes. So at every 10-minute intervals, it will run a job. However, you can bring that time down to a minimum of 1 minute, but it's not recommended going that low. 5 minutes sometimes is generally a nice time limit to set it to. So it would produce a job every 5 minutes. So a little bit of the architecture and components behind it. You find that a user that's changing a life cycle or a Vault client that's commands something, it could be a property update. What happens is that job is sent to the job processor and it's in a job queue, right? The job processor then would process that job and you would see it populate into your Vault once it's complete. Now, the job processor can be administrated, it can be managed, you can see what jobs are going in, you can pick up any errors that's there that it comes up with, if there is any. So typical errors sometimes that come up is a property error. So if a property is non-compliant in Vault, it would come up with a property error saying that it cannot do it because the property is non-compliant. Alternatively, if the job processor does not have full read-write access permission given to it, it would not be able to produce a job. So you've got to give it full permissions to actually do its job. So looking at the license and installation of it, so Vault license is required. Okay, if it's a multi-user license, and no if it's a single user license. So basically what that means, if it's a network license, it will pull a license from the server to run the job in the back. If it's a single user license and it's installed on the same machine as a Vault client, it will use that Vault license to run the job. It does require Inventor and AutoCAD for DWF creation and property synchronization. And it also requires Office for property synchronization. So it does require supporting applications as well. So just looking at the benefits of it, from the Actions tab, you can directly go in and update a job quickly. You can have a look at the view, the queue that's queuing up. And the bottom screenshot, you can see the job server queue. You can see what job it's doing, the ID of the job, the priority of it, where it's sitting on the job queue, as well as the status. Has it been completed or is it pending? Right. So again, offloading visualization file, work in progress files to the dedicated job processor machine. This will increase your performance when checking in. So put a performance thing here. When you check in a file, you'll find that it's a lot quicker to actually create a visualization file when checking because it's handled by the job processor and not your computer. Title block updates. So generally what happens is if it's a property that's writing back to the title block and also state change or revision change, this is replaced by the job processor. So it takes away that manual task. And as we discussed, creating the released PDF on release, it would be handled by the job processor if it's set up that way. So the job processor will manage that task in the background, which is really, really great because it avoids you from going in and creating the PDF manually. All right. So that brings us to kind of the end of our discussion around creating and managing and using life cycles inside of Vault, and also gives you an introduction to what the requirements are. So we've seen that in the takeaway side, we'll see that routing of design files, it's designed for routing of files. So you would go in and have a file root from different lifecycle states. You can control access of the design file, as we've seen that the access control can become critical or can become important when designing or when working in a design office. You don't want everyone having access to the work in progress stuff. You want the guys having access to what's released, or the reviewer, you want him access to just having viewing and modifying review files itself. And also the control release that comes back into the routing will be controlled by a change order. You can track whatever changes that has been done on the file. So it makes it great for future references. If you want to see why the design has changed, what has changed on it, and who has done the change, the change order is very good for that. And also, I think just the revision management of a file becomes critical. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions now. So please, if you have any questions, please use the type box to actually type it out or raise your hand, and yeah, and then we can address it from there. No questions at the end. We'll give you a couple of more minutes. If there is anything, please feel free to type it in. Okay, so there's a question about an engineering change order. Read it out. The question says, can you start off a design with an engineering change order? Yes, you can. So we have clients that start up their design as a notification and a routing and a workflow. So you create the design, the change order, attach all of the supporting documents to that, and have that route to the specific users. And as it's being changed, you control the change order with the lifecycle, and you have that move across. So yes, that is possible. If there's any more So I see there's no further questions. Please, if you want a copy of the recording, you can always check it out on our Baker Baines website. Under training, you'll find webinars. You could actually go in and look at, watch the webinar, or find any other webinars that might interest you that has been conducted in the past. Alternatively, you could send me an email at Daniel, DANEEL, at bakerbaines.com, or you could send an email to info@bakerbaines, and we'll be more than happy to get in touch with regards to any questions that you might have on Vault Lifecycles. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. Following this webinar, I've got a What's New Inventor and What's New Vault 2020 webinar coming up. So please be sure to register for that, and I look forward to having you on that. Thank you very much, and have a great day ahead.